Let me begin with the mistake. Not the tactical mistake. There were several of those, and later historians would number them, name them, and present them in lectures with colored diagrams and the grave professional tone people use when discussing catastrophes they are relieved to have survived personally. I mean the older mistake. The foundational one. The mistake of believing the galaxy had already shown us everything it knew how to be. At the height of the Halcyon Mandate, we considered ourselves the final argument in intelligent life. We had taken 9 worlds by force, persuaded 11 more to submit by demonstrating what would happen if they preferred principle to survival, and built a fleet line so broad across the merit span that junior officers used to call it the second horizon. We had armor. We had doctrine. We had certainty sharpened to a state religion. Most importantly, we had the kind of historical momentum that makes an empire believe history itself has stopped being a conversation and become an applause track. Then there were the humans. You may think, from the way I say that now, that the warning was immediate. It was not. Warnings are rarely immediate when arrogance is involved. Arrogance is an excellent insulator. It keeps the cold truth out until the walls themselves begin to fail. My name is Sel Aric, Registry Grade 4, Strategic Review Office, Outer Threat Analytics Division. This sounds more impressive than it was. In practical terms, I was the one who read the packets senior people waved away and the one who kept noticing patterns everyone else preferred to classify as statistical clutter. I had 3 eyes, 1 damaged, 2 reliable, and enough professional curiosity to be considered tiresome by every superior I ever served under. That curiosity is the only reason I am alive to write this. At the time, Earth was listed in our archives as a low-priority emerging world. Atmosphere stable. Industry scaling. Primitive orbital capability. High internal conflict. Moderate signal leakage. Notable entertainment output. No immediate strategic concern. I had read every file. All of them. Intercepted broadcasts. Long-range thermal surveys. Manufacturing irregularities. Cultural abstracts written by bored xenologists who did not know they were handling live explosive material. Humans fascinated me in the way fault lines fascinate people who understand geology. Most observers saw a noisy, divided species making too much music and too many engines. I saw something else. Repetition, adaptation, and an almost pathological refusal to stop learning from humiliation. This was not, in my experience, a comforting combination. When I raised the concern the first time, my section chief laughed. When I raised it the second time, he assigned me to cargo trend review as punishment. When I raised it the third time, he told me that if I wanted to build a career out of fearing underdeveloped mammals with unstable governments and weak perimeter fleets, I should at least do the mandate the courtesy of sounding embarrassed while I did it. I did not sound embarrassed. That, I admit, was one of my smaller flaws. Still, I filed the concern reports. Still, I marked Earth for watch escalation. Still, on the morning this story truly began, when a battered civilian shuttle crossed into our patrol envelope broadcasting a distress code it should never have known, I looked up from my station and felt every instinct I possessed align around one very simple conclusion. We had just been handed something too useful to be real. And because we were who we were, everyone important was about to call that an opportunity. The shuttle was wrong before it finished docking. I do not mean damaged, though it was certainly that. The hull plating was scorched along the port side, one stabilizer fin had been patched with material that did not match the original frame, and the drive output flickered across the bay monitors with the uneven rhythm of something held together by maintenance habits more affectionate than official. No, the wrongness was conceptual. Distress craft do not enter a mandate patrol corridor broadcasting a local military emergency code unless one of 3 things has happened. Either they are ours, they have stolen something they do not fully understand, or they know exactly what they are doing and would like you to waste the next 2 hours deciding between the first 2 explanations. I was in the observation gallery above Dock Ring 4 when they brought it in, pressed closer to the glass than dignity required and farther than regulation preferred. Below me, the reception team assembled in a geometry I recognized immediately: 4 armed Marines, 1 medical technician, 1 signal officer, and Commander Tal Vane standing half a pace ahead of the rest like a man who believed posture alone could pre-resolve whatever emerged from the hatch. Tal Vane was Fleet Second Under Sector Marshal Corvin and, in all meaningful ways, the kind of officer empires mass-produce when they have started winning too easily. Broad frame, polished command carapace, a campaign sash from 3 subjugations, and the relaxed expression of someone who had spent the better part of a decade being correct in situations that required little imagination and rewarded less. The shuttle seal released. Steam vented from the lower locks. And out walked a human woman carrying no visible weapon, wearing civilian clothes, and smiling as though she had just arrived at the right address after a slightly inconvenient delay. That smile was the fourth warning sign. Humans are soft-looking creatures by mandate standards. 2 eyes only. No shell plating. No auxiliary limbs. No visible venom structures. They look, at first glance, like a species that should have been shaped much more harshly by the universe than it apparently was. This one was medium height, dark-haired, skin the warm brown of oxidized copper, with one sleeve torn at the elbow and a bruise along the jaw that had gone yellow at the edges from age rather than impact. She stepped down from the shuttle ramp with both hands visible and her chin slightly raised. Not defiant. Not submissive either. Just calibrated. That is the word I would use now, 15 years and a stack of consequences later. At the time I used a less precise internal phrase. She looks like she knows where this conversation ends. Tal Vane let the silence lengthen around her entrance, which was good command work if you like your command work theatrical. State your identity, he said. She answered in clean mandate trade. Not translator-assisted. Not haltingly acquired. Cling. My name is Mara Vale, she said. I'm here to offer terms. Around me in the gallery, 3 analysts and 1 logistics clerk all shifted at once. Tal Vane did not move at all. Terms, he repeated as if trying the word for structural flaws. Yes. You crossed a restricted military patrol zone broadcasting a sovereign emergency code. Yes. You entered this sector alone. No, she said pleasantly. I entered it first. That was warning sign 5, though by then the numbering had become more of a lifestyle than a system. Below me, one of the Marines tightened his grip on the pulse carbine. The signal officer looked sideways at Tal Vane, who kept his attention fixed on Mara Vale with the expression senior commanders adopt when they believe a situation is strange but still ultimately underneath them. You will explain, he said. I intend to. She glanced once around the docking bay, taking in the Marines, the overhead rails, the active cameras, the emergency bulkhead geometry. It was not the glance of someone overwhelmed by unfamiliar machinery. It was the glance of someone confirming the furniture had not moved since she last imagined the room. But it would be more efficient somewhere quieter. Tal Vane almost smiled. That was the moment I knew we were in danger. Not because of her. Because of him. He thought this was now a matter of power presentation. He thought the human on his docking floor had correctly identified who held advantage and was adjusting her tone accordingly. He thought he was watching a frightened outsider attempt composure in front of superior force. What he was actually watching was a person who had prepared for him specifically and was now waiting to see how accurately she had guessed his first mistake. I pulled up the live bioscan feed on my wrist slate. Name Mara Vale. Species, human. Estimated age, 39 local years. Stress indicators, elevated but stable. Cardiac pattern, controlled. Respiration, controlled. Recorded possessions, none immediately threatening. That last line was there to reassure lesser minds. It did not reassure mine. Tal Vane turned to the signal officer. Have command prepare an intake room. Then back to Mara Vale. You will speak under monitored conditions. I assumed I would, she said. No tremor. No deflection. No bargaining for better treatment. No attempt to inflate her leverage too early. She sounded like someone checking off a step in a process that had already been rehearsed. One of the gallery analysts beside me muttered, She's either very brave or very stupid. No, I said before I could stop myself. He turned. Below us, Tal Vane gestured, and the Marines closed in around Mara Vale in escort formation. She went with them easily, still wearing that small, infuriatingly appropriate smile, as if everything happening now belonged exactly where it belonged. The analyst beside me frowned. What? I kept watching the docking floor as the group moved toward the secured corridor. She's prepared, I said. That should have been enough to alarm someone. It wasn't. Because preparation, when it belongs to the smaller party, often looks to larger powers like desperation wearing good manners. And the mandate, at that point in our history, had made an empire out of confusing those two things. The first debrief lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes. I know this because I watched all of it from the restricted review bay above intake chamber 3, where analysts without clearance for the room itself were still allowed to observe through filtered glass and pretend that access from above counted as participation. It does not. Commander Tal Vane sat at the head of the chamber table with the posture of a man indulging a curiosity he fully expected to become useful. To his left sat Strategic Clerk Denmar with a live record slate. To his right, 2 fleet cryptographers, 1 cultural analyst, and a security monitor who looked bored in the professional way soldiers do when they think nothing in the room can threaten them physically. Mara Vale sat alone on the opposite side. No restraints. No translator. No advocate. No visible concern. That last part was the worst of it. Human fear is not difficult to read once you've spent enough years studying their face and voice patterns. They are expressive creatures even when trying not to be. The mouth tightens, the eyes overfocus, the breath shortens in tiny intervals they themselves rarely notice. Mara Vale displayed none of that. Elevated stress markers, yes. She was alive, not carved from insulation foam. But her stress looked directional. Functional. Like someone performing inside acceptable tolerance rather than someone trapped. Tal Vane began without preamble. You said you were here to offer terms. Yes. For what? For an acquisition opportunity. That got the room's attention in the worst possible way. Greed first, caution second. Tal Vane leaned back slightly. Explain. Mara folded her hands on the table. Your command has known about Earth for decades, she said. You've classified us as pre-consolidation, technologically uneven, politically fragmented, and strategically vulnerable to external pressure if approached before full orbital defense coordination is complete. No one in the room spoke. Not because she was wrong. Because she wasn't supposed to know the exact language. Tal Vane did the right thing for once. Continue. I can provide, she said, the current coordinates of coalition command relays, fixed defense platforms, deep orbit supply caches, strategic fuel reserves, and the encrypted handoff protocols used between regional military authorities in the Sol system. The cryptographer stopped looking bored. Denmar's recording stylus paused just once in midair before resuming. Mara went on. I can identify which defense stations are actually armed, which are decoys for political funding purposes, which officers are competent under pressure, which ones are ceremonial appointments, and which orbital structures will be evacuated first in the event of full system incursion. She tilted her head very slightly. I can also tell you which routes your fleet planners will prefer and which of those routes my people are most likely to expect. There it was. Not information. Catnip. The kind of package that makes command officers believe the universe has finally developed respect for efficiency. Tal Vane's expression changed by less than half a degree, but to anyone who had served under him long enough, it was unmistakable. He was no longer handling an anomaly. He was handling an asset. And the cost, he asked. Safe passage for myself and 31 named personnel. Non-custodial transfer out of Sol jurisdiction before active operations begin. Settlement rights beyond mandate military sectors. No biological experimentation, no interrogation chaining, and no transfer of my team to industrial labor contracts. The cultural analyst actually let out a soft breath through her nose. Because that was the most convincing part. Not the coordinates. Not the relays. Not the access. The price. Low enough to be plausible. High enough to sound personal. Specific enough to smell real. I felt something cold pass through all three of my hearts. Tal Vane steepled his claws. Why? Mara did not answer too quickly, which I noticed immediately and everyone else interpreted as sincerity. Because my government discarded me, she said. That was the sentence they had wanted. Not that exact one, perhaps, but the shape of it. The perfect emotional key for a militarized intelligence hierarchy. Personal grievance, institutional resentment, controlled betrayal, rationalized self-interest. She gave them enough history to harden the story. A policy dispute. A strategic council split. Loss of standing. Loss of access. Loss of future. Not melodrama. Just enough injury to explain treason in a way that made power feel flattered rather than threatened. Tal Vane listened with the still pleasure of a man receiving confirmation from the universe that he had been right all along about how most beings work when presented with sufficient pressure. I stopped taking notes and started building my first refusal report. Not because I had proof she was lying. That was the part nobody around me ever understood. The danger was not that she was obviously false. The danger was that she was exactly believable enough. By the end of the debrief, Tal Vane had not committed to any formal agreement. He was too seasoned for that. But the room had already tilted. You could feel it in the questions that followed. They were no longer trying to determine whether she was a trap. They were trying to determine how quickly her data could be verified and operationalized. That is always the beginning of the real mistake. Not belief. Momentum. After the session, I requested immediate review time with Senior Intelligence Director Carol Thane. He granted me 9 minutes, which was already insultingly generous by his standards, and told me he had heard enough of the debrief summary to feel pleased. His office overlooked the inner dock lattice and contained exactly what all such offices contain. Polished surfaces, controlled light, campaign insignia framed as if survival under previous bad decisions somehow qualified a person to make new ones. Carol did not ask me to sit. That was quick, he said. That is why it's bad. His secondary eye ridge lowered. You're doing it again. Yes. Again meant pattern fixation. Again meant Earth. Again meant my professionally inconvenient habit of noticing that humans often became more dangerous the more straightforward they appeared. She knows our strategic classifications, I said. Not our existence. Not our language. Our internal evaluation structure. She may have inferred it. She may have. She may also have built her entire entrance around what we would most want to hear from a defector. Carol gave me the long-suffering look administrators reserve for people who are correct too often to be discarded and irritating too often to be promoted. The preliminary verification team will test everything, he said. That is not enough. It is exactly enough at this stage. No. Verification tells us whether the information is real. It does not tell us whether the situation is genuine. He turned toward the viewport for a moment, clasping his hands behind his back in the pose of a man arranging patients for public display. She has offered us the cleanest access package I have seen in 15 years, he said. That is my concern. You are concerned, he said flatly, that an enemy source has given us highly actionable intelligence at low extraction cost. Yes. Carol turned back to me. There are moments when institutions reveal what they really worship, and it is almost never wisdom. Usually it is efficiency with good posture. You have spent too long studying this species, he said. You keep assigning them a depth they have not earned. No, I said. I keep assigning them the depth they keep demonstrating when no one important is watching. He exhaled once, already done with me. The data will be verified. Until then, this remains above your decision grade. Which was another way of saying, we are already emotionally committed to the gift, and now we only require the paperwork that will let us call desire due diligence. I left his office with my jaw set hard enough to hurt. At my station, I opened a private analysis tag under Sol System Watch and typed 7 words. Too accurate. Too easy. Watch what is missing. Then I duplicated every feed link to Mara Vale's file and began reading. Because if there is one thing more dangerous than a good lie, it is a truth engineered to arrive at exactly the right appetite. Verification began within 6 hours. That, in retrospect, was the moment we lost. Not when Mara Vale entered the patrol corridor. Not when Tal Vane smiled at the size of what she was offering. Not even when Carol Thane dismissed my objection with the polished patience senior officials reserved for subordinates they intend to be right over later. We lost when the machine of command turned itself toward confirming the gift instead of interrogating the conditions under which the gift had arrived. Because institutions, like predators, become slower-minded when meat is already in their mouths. The first verification packet hit my console at cycle turn. 3 command relay coordinates cross-matched successfully against our own outer system survey models. 2 authentication strings produced clean handshake responses when tested against intercepted human traffic archives. 1 orbital fuel reserve marker aligned with heat loss data from an observation sweep taken 9 cycles earlier but never properly analyzed because no one had expected a meaningful military cache to be hidden inside a civilian shipping shell. Everything she gave us began to glitter with the awful credibility of partial success. Around me in the review pit, analysts who had ignored Sol for years were suddenly interested in Sol with the vulgar appetite of gamblers handed a loaded instrument and told it belonged to them. Screens lit. Side conversations multiplied. Someone in signals actually laughed once, short, disbelieving, delighted, and then pretended he had coughed when he realized I was looking at him. By second cycle, Commander Tal Vane had transferred Mara Vale from monitored intake to guest status containment on the middeck. Guest status. That was what the order said. Not detainee. Not hostile foreign asset. Not controlled source. Guest. I read that line 3 times and felt something inside me go very cold and very still. Guest status meant lighter guard, more movement, restricted but non-zero terminal access, conversational handling protocols instead of coercive ones, and, most dangerously of all, the quiet psychological repositioning that occurs the first time command starts imagining a defector as someone who has chosen them rather than someone who may simply be using their architecture for her own work. I filed my second objection directly into the source handling review chain. It came back 18 minutes later with a notation from Carol Thane himself. Observed concerns acknowledged. Current evidence supports continued cooperative processing. Do not duplicate prior speculative language without new material basis. That was how he wrote when he wanted a subordinate to understand that the issue was no longer evidence. It was tone. Fine. I changed tone. On cycle 3 I submitted a narrower report. No language about traps. No cultural analysis. No human strategic doctrine references. No mention of long-game deception structures or pattern self-presentation. Just the facts. Source entered a military corridor using a restricted emergency code. Source demonstrated classified language familiarity beyond plausible civilian acquisition. Source offered intelligence package of unusually high operational value at unusually low extraction cost. Source psychological presentation remained too stable for someone in her alleged position. Recommendation: suspend planning assumptions until full motivational architecture is better understood. Claim: professional. Stripped of everything senior people call interpretation, when interpretation becomes inconvenient. It went nowhere. Not rejected. Not attacked. Not even disputed. Just nowhere. That is another thing institutions do when they are in love with a useful story. They stop needing to defeat dissent and simply begin placing it in rooms from which outcome cannot hear it. Meanwhile, Mara Vale became increasingly comfortable. I watched her through internal monitoring loops because by then I had admitted to myself that obsession was simply the most honest word available. She moved through the mid-deck comment sections with the ease of someone who had already mapped them. She read public campaign histories on the exchange terminals. She requested and was granted access to older Mandate expansion records for context. She ate whatever nutrition blocks or broth concentrates they brought her without visible complaint, which should have alarmed more people than it did because Mandate rationing cuisine is what happens when engineers are briefly allowed to hate morale. Most of all, she rested. That was the detail I could not stop circling. People who have betrayed their governments do not usually sleep easily on foreign warships. They flinch. They pace. They rehearse. Their bodies continue arguing with the decision long after the conscious mind has packaged it into principle or resentment. Mara Vale slept on regular cycles. Deeply. I know because I checked. Twice. 3 times on cycle 4. That is not what someone in active collapse looks like. That is what someone waiting for a schedule to mature looks like. When I said as much to analyst Saran in the pit, he gave me the look people reserve for relatives who are competent enough to be tolerated but not enough to be trusted with celebration. Maybe, he said, humans betray each other more comfortably than we do. That is not comfort, I said. That is timing. He shrugged. He was young enough to believe that if enough of a package checked out, the motives attached to it could safely be treated as decoration. By cycle 5, Tal Vane visited Mara personally. That should have required 3 signatures and a strategic reason. Instead it happened because senior officers are mammals at heart, no matter how much plating or doctrine you put on them, and mammals like to approach things that make them feel chosen. He brought her a hospitality tray. Filtered mineral water. Archive scrolls of Mandate victories. A translated historical compendium on sector consolidation. The message could not have been clearer if engraved into metal. You have impressed the winning side. Welcome to relevance. I watched the whole exchange from a maintenance feed splice I was absolutely not authorized to use and therefore relied upon heavily. Tal stood at the threshold of her quarters with the ceremonial stiffness of a commander performing civility for the first time that week. Mara accepted the offerings with grave, measured gratitude in flawless trade standard, then said in the mild tone of someone clarifying the weather, "When this concludes, Commander, I want to ensure what happened is understood correctly by everyone who matters." Tal inclined his head. Please. As if he had just been handed a statement about post-conflict clarity. I felt my secondary heart stutter hard enough to hurt. Because she did not sound grateful. She sounded anticipatory. That is the danger of certain sentences. Their meaning depends less on the words than on the face carrying them, and Mara Vale had the expression of someone who had already watched the final shape of an event settle into place and was now waiting for slower minds to catch up to the frame. I requested emergency review with Carol again. Denied. I submitted a behavioral anomaly supplement to source handling. No response. I attached a probability model to the defector narrative itself. The odds of a politically disaffected strategic officer independently acquiring restricted foreign emergency frequencies, surviving transit, entering a hostile patrol corridor at exactly the right confidence level, and offering the entire invasion architecture of her home system for a price this low were not reassuringly small. They were mathematically theatrical. That report received one line in return. Behavioral confidence remains consistent with grievance-driven realignment. There it was. The explanation they wanted. Not because it was the best supported. Because it was the most flattering. If Mara Vale was a wronged insider seeking revenge, then the mandate remained what it believed itself to be, powerful enough to attract the enemy's useful betrayals, clever enough to reward them, efficient enough to convert private resentment into public conquest. That story made everyone important feel intelligent. The alternative story, that they were being shown exactly what they most wanted to see by someone who had studied their appetites better than they had studied her, required a degree of self-suspicion no imperial structure ever develops voluntarily. On Cycle 6, I opened a private subfile under Soul Watch and renamed it. Not potential defector instability. Not source handling risks. Not even operational concern. Incomplete intelligence package. I renamed it. Why was this built for us? Then I locked the file, duplicated every shipping log Mara had not mentioned, and began looking for the places where reality had become too smooth to trust. By Cycle 9, Mara Vale had become impossible to explain and therefore to everyone above me safe. This is a pattern worth studying in any imperial bureaucracy. Once a thing becomes too strange to fit the preferred narrative, command does not usually revise the narrative. It revises its attention span. The intelligence package kept verifying. Relay coordinates aligned. Old authentication strings opened exactly where they should. Defense schedules matched archival intercepts with the kind of seductive precision that makes analysts start speaking about clean acquisition windows in the voice gamblers use for guaranteed outcomes right before losing a family inheritance. And because the data continued paying dividends, nobody wanted to look too closely at the person who had brought it. I did. I watched Mara Vale through every feat I could justify and 3 I could not. She ate on a steady cycle. She slept without chemical assistance. She used the exchange terminals to request public historical records from our outer expansion campaigns, then read them with the intense, patient attention of a student reviewing material that would later be tested. She did not ask for entertainment. She did not request private accommodations beyond what had already been granted. She did not attempt escape. She did not try to signal anyone. Most of all, she never once behaved like a person who had severed herself from her own species and boarded an enemy vessel with nothing but a bargain and an uncertain future. She behaved like someone halfway through an assignment. That was the phrase I finally wrote in my personal analysis notes. Source posture resembles mission continuation behavior, not asylum behavior. I sent a cleaner version of that sentence up through source handling. No response. On Cycle 11, I was formally reassigned to Archival Discrepancy Review. That is not where a serious intelligence service sends its rising minds. It is where it places useful irritants while deciding whether to preserve them for later or let them calcify among old paperwork. Deep Archive lives 3 decks below the active analysis banks in a section of the ship designed by minds that believed illumination was a reward best earned by combat branches. Survey logs. Inventory drift. Dead files. Clerical variance reconciliation. The work was structurally endless and spiritually offensive. Carroll's notation on the reassignment order described it as temporary analytical recalibration. I read that line twice and admired, in a distant professional way, the elegance with which a bureaucracy can insult someone while pretending to maintain them. So I went. And because my career had already been handed a shovel and told to admire the geology, I dug. Old survey banks. Civilian freight logs. Thermal anomalies that did not fit declared shipping density. Transit insurance records. Agricultural contracts. Medical stock runs. Construction aggregates routed to nowhere worth building. If Mara had given command the official map, I wanted the unofficial one. On Cycle 14, while cross-referencing outer system cargo manifests against declared civilian need, I saw her do the thing that finally made my lower respiratory vents tighten hard enough to ache. She was standing in the mid-deck commons, one hand around a cup of nutrient broth she never seemed to dislike, reading a military history abstract on one of the exchange screens. Then all at once she looked up. Not at a person. At the ceiling. At the primary sensor trunk running above the commons bulkhead. And she smiled. A small smile. Private. Not for the room. Not for the guard seated near the hatch. Not for the camera if she knew it was there, which of course she did. The kind of smile someone gives when a monitored variable moves exactly as forecast. I saved the frame. Ran it again. Then again slower. People later told me I was assigning too much meaning to one facial expression. Those people did not survive long in my line of work. I opened a new report immediately. No rhetoric this time. No human psychology. No, why was this built for us? Just behavior, sequence, timing. Source demonstrates anomalous calm under indefinite foreign custody. Source displays repeated study behavior directed at mandate history and campaign doctrine. Source shows no observable anxiety pattern consistent with defection instability. Source appears to respond positively to ongoing environmental developments not disclosed to ordinary monitoring staff. Recommendation: suspend source integration into operational planning until unknown expectation variable is identified. I sent it to Carol. I sent a duplicate to Tal Vane's intelligence aide. I sent a third copy to two analysts senior enough to be embarrassed if they ignored it and junior enough to still sometimes read their messages. The only answer I got came from Carol, 8 hours later. You are to refrain from unsolicited source pattern escalation outside your current assignment scope. There it was. Not rebuttal. Not correction. Not even disagreement. Just management. Which was worse. Because by then I no longer needed anyone to confirm that Mara Vale was dangerous. I needed someone, anyone, to notice that the system itself had begun behaving in exactly the way a patient enemy would have predicted it would. We had done the thing. We had heard the warning voice. We had filed the warning voice. We had removed the warning voice from the main decision floor. And then, satisfied with our own procedural maturity, we had continued exactly as before. That night, alone in deep archive with a stack of freight records and a view of nothing but dusted survey canisters, I pulled up the outer shipping maps one more time and started following the cargo lanes Mara had never mentioned. Because if she was waiting for a known hour, I intended to know what clock she had been watching. The verification report arrived on cycle 16. It was 51 pages long, stamped at 3 different clearance levels, and written in the dry, triumphant language analysts use when they suspect they are about to be thanked by people with larger offices. I read the conclusion first. Provided intelligence package demonstrates high reliability across all tested categories. Operational confidence rating elevated. That was the sentence that made my damaged eye start throbbing. Not because it was wrong. Because it was precise in the wrong direction. I went through the body of the report line by line. Relay coordinates, confirmed. Historic encryption chains, confirmed. Fuel reserve mapping, confirmed. Personnel rotations at named installations, confirmed against signal drift and archived observation windows. Orbital defense station classifications, confirmed. Transit lane weaknesses, confirmed. All of it real. All of it usable. All of it, by the report's own proud logic, proving that Mara Vale was exactly what Command wanted her to be. A strategic insider with a grievance deep enough to hand an empire the knife and help point it. Around me in deep archive, the lights hummed at their usual level of institutional contempt. 2 junior clerks in the far aisle were arguing softly over a survey mislabel from 50 years earlier. Somewhere overhead, the maintenance ducts clicked with the sound of a ship pretending not to age. I read the conclusion again. Then I said out loud, to no one and to the shelves and to the dead survey canisters and to whatever powers briefly supervise intelligence work before getting tired and leaving, that is not the question. One of the clerks looked over. I ignored him. Because here is the thing every analyst learns young and then forgets whenever an operation begins to smell like promotion. Verified data tells you that what you were given is real. It tells you nothing at all about whether what you were given is sufficient. Mara Vale had provided us a map. Very good. The verification team had just spent 16 cycles proving the map was accurate. Also very good. No one in those 16 cycles, not Tal Vane, not Carol Thane, not the cryptographers, not the source handlers, not the optimization planners who were by now certainly building elegant invasion timetables atop her information, had asked the one question that mattered. What was not on the map? I opened the civilian freight records. Not military shipping. Those had already been mined to exhaustion by people who believed threats arrived wearing appropriate labels. Civilian. Agricultural tonnage. Medical cold chain routes. Structural composite shipments. Atmospheric processors. Water recyclers. Bulk protein substrate. Habitat fabric. Mining tools. Chemical precursors too boring to deserve strategic attention. Boring things are dangerous in the hands of a species willing to build a war out of logistics and then teach itself not to brag about it. I ran every outbound freight contract linked to Sol System commercial lanes over the last 26 cycles. At first the pattern was invisible in the way all important patterns are invisible when buried under enough ordinary movement. Human shipping was noisy, decentralized, redundant, full of private operators, overlapping jurisdictions, contractor shells, and the kind of civilian commercial confusion military planners hate because it refuses to arrange itself into a neat target deck. So I stripped out the declarations and watched only the destinations. Then I stripped out named destinations and watched only the intersections. Then I stripped out intersections and watched only repeated deep space convergence. That was when the 4 points appeared. Not planets. Not stations. Not declared depots. Just 4 cold coordinates in the outer system, far enough beyond the defended orbital spine that Mandate doctrine treated them as strategic weather rather than infrastructure. I stared at them for a very long time. Then I checked the dates. Freight concentration across those 4 points had doubled over 14 cycles. Not military freight. Not on paper. Civilian contracts. Civilian routing. Civilian hull signatures. Civilian support justification. The sort of movement command ignores because command has spent too many generations teaching itself that war begins where the warships are. I cross-referenced Mara Vale's package. No mention of those coordinates. None. I checked again. Still none. Every major relay. Every orbital reserve. Every named platform. Every official chain she had handed us with such careful generosity. But not those 4 points. The cold moved properly through me then. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Mara had not given us false intelligence. She had given us intelligence shaped around what we already considered meaningful. That is a much higher level of deception. It does not fight your assumptions. It recruits them. I opened a new report and wrote faster than was dignified. Preliminary anomaly assessment. Repeated civilian freight convergence at 4 undeclared outer system coordinates excluded from current human source package. Pattern persistence inconsistent with ordinary commercial drift. Possible explanations include concealed industrial assembly, distributed storage architecture, or undeclared military infrastructure beyond current mandate threat zoning. Immediate long-range survey recommended prior to any operational planning based on source package. Claim. Specific. No dramatics. No human psychology. No trapped language. Nothing for Carol to dismiss as my familiar species fixation. I sent it to him. Copied Tal Vane's planning liaison. Copied 2 senior analysts who still, on good days, remembered that intelligence work involves noticing things before operations are built atop their absence. Then I waited. The first reply came from Tal Vane's liaison 11 hours later. Operational planning is proceeding. Outer system anomalies do not presently alter confidence in source-derived interior access map. There it was. Interior access map. A beautiful phrase. A phrase built entirely from appetite. The second reply came from Carol 4 hours after that. You are instructed to refrain from unsolicited distribution outside current archival assignment scope. Not wrong. Not impossible. Not disproven. Just outside scope. That is how systems tell the truth to shut up. I read both messages twice. Then I opened the mid-deck monitoring feed. Mara Vale was in the commons again, seated at a terminal, reading one of our campaign histories with the relaxed concentration of someone reviewing a case study already marked complete. One guard stood by the hatch pretending not to watch her. Another passed in the corridor carrying ration trays. On the screen in front of her, the campaign map scrolled past a region we had taken 12 years earlier and still described as pacified, which was one of several reasons I no longer trusted our archives as a measure of anything but administrative mood. Mara turned one page. Paused. And though the camera angle was wrong to catch her face cleanly, I could tell from the line of her shoulders that she was smiling again. Not because she knew I had found the 4 points. Because she knew that if anyone did find them, the institution would do exactly what ours had just done. Thank the warning, file the warning, and proceed anyway. That was when I understood the real architecture of the operation. She did not need everyone to miss the pattern. She needed one person to find it. One credible dissenter. One professional objector. One useful alarm. Not to stop the invasion. To prove the invasion had already heard and overruled the alarm inside its own process. I sat back in my chair in deep archive, hands flat on the console, and looked at the 4 cold coordinates glowing on the screen like patient teeth in the dark outer reaches of a system we still believed we understood. Then I started my most important report. Because if I was going to be the warning they buried, I intended to make the burial as expensive and well-documented as possible. I sent the report above Carol Thane. That was not a dramatic act. It sounds dramatic when written afterward, especially by people who enjoy narratives in which a low-ranking analyst risks everything in one clean principled gesture and then goes down in moral fire. Real institutions are seldom that cinematic. What I did was open the escalation lattice, choose the rarely used senior review path, attach the freight convergence analysis, append every prior warning I had filed on Mara Vale, and submit it to strategic oversight with a recommendation for immediate suspension of all operational movement into Sol until the 4 outer system coordinates had been surveyed properly. Then I waited 11 hours. On the 12th, security came to Deep Archive. Not armed response. Not arrest squad. Just 2 internal compliance officers in gray-black review armor carrying tablets and the expression of people tasked with performing an unpleasant but administratively tidy chore before lunch. Analyst Sel Aric, the taller one, said, "Your system privileges are suspended pending conduct review." I looked at him. Then at the tablet. Then back at him. "Conduct," I said. "Yes. Not judgment. That is the language in the order." Of course it was. Carol had chosen well. If they punished me for being wrong, the system would have to engage the substance. If they punished me for conduct, the substance could remain politely untouched while procedure put me in a box and labeled the box handled. I surrendered my active codes. My command channel access vanished first. Then my live logistics overlays. Then the secure signal splice I had no business still possessing. At the end I was left with archival view rights, static records access, and the official instruction to remain within Deep Archive until further review. The officer paused at the door before leaving. "There is a notation," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "that your concerns have been received." "Yes," I said. "That seems to be the problem." After they left, I sat alone in the dim hum of dead files and felt, more than thought, the shape of the operation tightening around us. Not because I had been silenced. Because I had been silenced correctly. That distinction mattered. An enemy plan built around brute confidence expects your officers to dismiss warning. A very good enemy plan expects one warning voice to persist just long enough that leadership can overrule it and thereby reassure itself that due diligence has occurred. Once that happens, the trap stops being external. It becomes certified by your own procedure. 3 cycles later, Mara Vale was admitted to operational consultation. I learned this from a routing error in the planning calendar that copied archive status updates to a terminal no one had realized I still technically retained. The notice described her as a source context advisor for final approach modeling. I read that phrase 3 times. Source context advisor. A civilian human defector with no formal standing aboard a mandate warship was now being asked to comment on our invasion geometry. I would like to tell you that someone, somewhere, looked at that and experienced a late conversion to wisdom. No one did. Tal Vane, I later learned, asked her one question in the planning room. Which vector would minimize defensive clustering by Earth's intersystem assets while preserving fleet cohesion across first entry? She gave him an answer. Of course she did. Not quickly. Not eagerly. Carefully, with the exact degree of professional hesitation required to make the recommendation feel earned rather than prepared. He thanked her. He adjusted the vector. She smiled. By cycle 31, the fleet had begun its quiet orientation into launch geometry. Deep Archive had no proper tactical display, but it had enough unauthorized leftovers for a person with patience and grievance to reconstruct what mattered. 400 ships across staggered lines. Forward grouping heavier than I would have preferred. Interior support craft nested too closely to command vessels. Beautiful formation if your aesthetic runs toward confidence so polished it stops noticing where the light goes missing. I pulled up the 4 outer coordinates again. Still there. Still cold. Still outside every official briefing deck. Still ignored. And that was when the final, ugliest piece fell into place for me. Mara Vale had not simply needed a command staff arrogant enough to trust her. She had needed a bureaucracy that would hear the one analyst who noticed the missing pattern, punish him in a way that looked procedural rather than fearful, and then proceed with the comfort of a system that believes concern, once documented and overruled, has been transformed into safety. In other words, she had not merely predicted us. She had budgeted for us. I sat in Deep Archive under lights too weak for dignity, surrounded by survey canisters from dead campaigns and obsolete mineral maps, and understood with perfect clarity that my reports had done exactly as much damage as her planners had intended them to do. Not enough to stop the operation. Enough to bless it. The fleet moved on cycle 33. Even stripped of my active access, I could still reconstruct enough of the deployment to feel sick in professional detail. Launch sequencing bled through the logistics lattice first, fuel draw spikes, tug route clearances, command priority overrides, maintenance holds pushed forward under operational necessity. Then the dock ring cameras began emptying one cradle after another into black. Heavy carriers. Spine cruisers. Interdiction barges. Point defense veils. 400 ships committing themselves to a beautiful shape selected, in part, by the woman we were still calling a source. I watched all of it from Deep Archive on systems I was not supposed to have and therefore trusted more than the sanctioned ones. The fleet formation was magnificent. That is important. You do not understand disaster correctly unless you first admit how convincing it looked from inside the disaster. Tal Vane's line had depth and discipline. The lead elements rode the approach corridor in a tapered wedge, support wings layered back in offset arcs, command hulls protected without being hidden, reserve firepower distributed just aggressively enough to signal confidence without sacrificing maneuver logic. If you knew nothing else, if you had not read the freight records, watched Mara Vale sleep like someone waiting for a timer, or spent 16 cycles learning how perfectly accurate information can still be designed to ruin you, you would have looked at that formation and thought what every empire wants to think at the edge of somebody else's system. This is inevitable. I looked at the 4 coordinates, then back at the formation, then back at the coordinates. The distances were not random. Neither were the intervals. Whoever had designed the insertion vector had not merely chosen a low-resistance entry lane. They had chosen a line that preserved mandate cohesion while maximizing overlap between our own support geometry and 4 deep outer points no planner had treated as relevant because those points did not exist inside the intelligence package Mara had gifted us so generously. The phrase I wrote in my private notes was, "Containment mathematics disguised as approach efficiency." No one read that note but me. At 312 ship standard, the fleet crossed the outer threshold of the Sol system. For the first 18 minutes, everything proceeded cleanly. No interceptors. No broad-spectrum challenge. No visible defensive redistribution. No surge from the inner orbital bands. No confirmation that Earth had even realized an invasion-scale formation was now inside the distance markers from which history usually becomes a very different kind of document. On the command relay, Tal Vane sounded pleased. Measured, of course. He was too senior to sound openly delighted in front of subordinates. But I had served under him long enough to hear the bright edge under his precision. He believed the first stage had gone exactly as Mara Vale predicted. Scattered response lag. Minimal defensive consolidation. Strategic confusion inside the target system. Which is to say, he believed the target system was behaving like prey. I opened the old freight convergence map one more time and laid it beside the live navigation feed. 4 points. 14 cycles of civilian cargo convergence. No declared military value. No survey priority. No place in the intelligence package. No reason, if you were looking with the wrong habits, to think they mattered more than gravel. The first platform came online at 3:31. There was no flare. No weapons bloom. No dramatic reveal in the childish style lesser species prefer when they want history to notice them. One moment outer point 1 was a cold nothing on every official map the fleet trusted. The next it was a fully powered combat mass unfolding its thermal signature from beneath a shell profile deliberately tuned to read as inert debris. The sensor graph in front of me climbed so hard and so cleanly that for a fraction of a second I thought the deep archive terminal had faulted. Then point 2 lit. Then point 3. Then point 4. Not stations improvised in panic. Not hidden bunkers waking by chance. Not a desperate last line. Prepared platforms. Heavy ones. Placed before our approach. Placed for our approach. Placed, I realized with the kind of clarity that makes a body briefly forget secondary functions, around the exact vector Mara Vale had encouraged Tal Vane to adopt in the planning room. On the command channel there was a silence of exactly 2 heartbeats. Then Tal Vane said, "What is that?" A useless question. Not because the answer was unclear. Because by the time a commander asks what is that about a thing this large, the thing has already become part of the future. The sensor officers began talking over one another. Thermal density. Weapons envelope. Power structure. Shield signatures. No registry match. No, not no match. No prior record at all because one cannot match a structure one never thought to imagine and therefore never looked for. I watched the formation overlay redraw itself in live time as the tactical software caught up with reality and finally admitted what I had been trying to tell the mandate for cycles. Our beautiful wedge was not entering an undefended system. It was sitting inside a box. A very expensive, very carefully measured, very human box. And it got worse. Because the platforms were not merely placed to fire on us. Any species with enough mass and enough fear can arrange guns around an approach corridor. That is not genius. It is geometry with a bad attitude. No, the genius, the humiliating part, was that the placement exploited our own fleet design against us. Forward combat hulls blocked the easiest withdrawal lanes for their own support carriers. Reserve arcs overlapped in exactly the wrong way if forced to disperse under sudden pressure. The command cluster, protected beautifully against frontal engagement, was now the least flexible part of the line because Tal Vane had preserved centralized control at the very point where a decentralized emergency response would have bought seconds. Mara Vale had not simply fed us old maps. She had shaped the way we would try to win with them. On the secondary channel, flagged advisory priority, her voice came through from the guest consultation relay. Not frightened. Not triumphant. Not breathless with revelation. Calm. Calm in exactly the same way she had been calm stepping off the shuttle, reading our histories, watching the ceiling, asking that everyone understand what had happened when this was over. "Commander," she said, "I want to make sure the situation is fully clear before anyone makes a fast choice." Even then Tal Vane did not understand what kind of sentence he was hearing. Because Tal still believed clarity was a courtesy. The first broad-spectrum transmission from the human platforms followed 9 seconds later. An older male voice. Steady cadence. Military but not ornamental about it. "Mandate Task Force, this is Defense Coordinator Elias Wren of the Sol Coalition Outer Network. Your formation has entered a controlled interdiction envelope. Your current vector, mass distribution, and support geometry have been confirmed. Do not advance. Terms are transmitting now. Terms. Not surrender demand. Not threat declaration. Not even warning. Terms." That was, I confess, the moment a part of me I had kept professionally armored for years finally gave way to the truth with full bodily force. Because species that plan terms before opening fire are species that expected you to arrive exactly as you did. The terms packet hit the deep archive relay 2 seconds after it reached command. Immediate withdrawal. No penetration beyond present line. Formal acknowledgement of hostile entry. 10-cycle non-engagement covenant. And one final condition, placed at the end in plain language with no ornament at all. All intelligence obtained from Mara Vale was to be returned, acknowledged in writing as the product of a deliberate counterintelligence operation, and declared unusable for any present or future hostile planning because it had been designed to become correct too early. I read that line once. Then again. That was the elegance of it. Not false intelligence. A perfect map of a world that no longer existed. Every verification team in the Mandate had confirmed it. Every confident officer had touched it. Every planner had trusted it because it agreed with everything they already believed about relevance and force and where meaningful defenses ought to be. All real. All precise. All obsolete by design. I put one hand flat on the deep archive console because the room had started to feel fractionally misaligned around me. On the command channel, Tal Vane was still asking for options. Weapons density. Dispersal probability. Shield survivability. Alternative vectors. All the usual late questions men ask when strategy has already become archaeology. But the answer was already present in the shape around us. The trap had not sprung. It had been closing for months. We had simply chosen this moment to notice the walls. Commander Tal Vane did what officers like Tal Vane always do when reality first stops obeying them. He began issuing commands in a louder voice. Not shouting. That would have been vulgar. Tal was too disciplined for vulgarity. But volume has many forms, and one of them is the rapid multiplication of certainty. Formation revision. Shield emphasis. Forward arc recalculation. Platform threat ranking. Tactical response tree. All the familiar rituals of control performed at speed, as if command language itself could generate a new geography around the fleet by being spoken hard enough. It could not. I listened from deep archive while men and women better armored and more highly ranked than I was finally discovered the limits of elegant doctrine inside somebody else's prepared mathematics. The first weapons assessment took 1 minute and 19 seconds. That was faster than I expected and slower than I would have liked if survival had still been available in the ordinary tactical sense. The platform outputs were bad. Not catastrophic at first glance, which somehow made them worse. If they had been absurdly overpowered, Tal could have blamed surprise and brute force later. But the numbers were merely exact. Enough to break the lead hulls, enough to fold the command spine under concentrated pressure, enough to make successful dispersal an exercise in sacrificing the right ships in the right order while under observation by a species that had already spent years thinking about what we would do once frightened. The navigation team proposed 3 withdrawal geometries. The first exposed the support carriers. The second stranded the rear interdiction barges. The third required a command split Tal Vane would never have tolerated under normal conditions and could not execute under these conditions without losing his own internal coordination net before the humans ever fired. He asked for probabilities. He got silence first. Then numbers. If you want to hear a fleet die in spirit before it dies in metal, listen to probabilities being explained to a proud commander by officers who know their honesty will not save him but are too professional to lie. At 3:49, Tal Vane opened a direct priority channel to Mara Vale. I did not hear his side of that conversation. The guest advisory line remained shielded from archive-level bleed, and even my less official access routes were not generous enough to cross that particular wall. I saw only the corresponding visual feed from her secured quarters. She was seated at the small table by the viewport, one hand resting beside a data slate that had been dark for at least an hour. She did not look surprised when the comm activated. She looked, if anything, mildly relieved, in the way people do when a clock finally reaches the number they have been watching for too long. She listened for a while. Then she answered. Calmly. No rush. No visible triumph. The face of a person discussing terms that had already existed before the room she was in realized it was part of them. I watched her speak for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When the line went dead, she did not move immediately. She looked once toward the ceiling, where the internal sensor trunk ran above the guest deck in its usual quiet gray strip, and then down at her folded hands. There was no smile this time. No performance at all. Only stillness. I've thought about that stillness often. Not because it was cruel. Because it wasn't. Cruelty likes witnesses. It likes the shape of itself in other people's faces. This was something colder and, to my mind, more impressive. Completion. At the 40-minute mark, Tal Vane accepted the terms. He did it in the tight, formal language of a man informing the universe that he remains grammatically in command even if materially it has become less obvious. The acknowledgement transmitted on all fleet channels, then on the broader tactical net, then again on the public interspecies emergency band because the human packet had specified very carefully which versions of reality would later be permitted to survive. We were to withdraw. We were to halt all advance. We were to acknowledge hostile intent. We were to enter a 10-cycle non-engagement covenant. And then there was the final condition. That was the one that settled deepest. Not because it changed the tactical outcome. By then the tactical outcome had already hardened. We were not getting to Earth. We were not forcing an engagement on favorable lines. We were not even, in any meaningful sense, negotiating. We were being arranged into survivable retreat by an enemy that had spent more time understanding our appetite than we had spent understanding our perimeter. No, the final condition mattered because it moved the defeat from the field into memory. All intelligence provided by Mara Vale was to be returned, archived under counterintelligence contamination protocols, and acknowledged in writing as the product of a deliberate strategic deception operation designed to induce hostile commitment under false temporal confidence. In plainer terms, we were required to say on the record that we had been played. Not just beaten. Not just checked. Played. That is a harder thing for an empire to survive. Ships can be rebuilt. Formations can be revised. Commanders can be retired into quieter offices and surrounded with language soft enough to disguise the crater. But record is different. Record lingers. Record travels. Record becomes the version of humiliation younger officers study later with careful faces and private relief that it happened to someone else. I understood the brilliance of that clause immediately, because by then I had spent enough cycles following human logic to recognize what it values after victory. Not spectacle. Not maximal destruction. Not even revenge, at least not in the theatrical form our military histories preferred. Humans, when they are being strategic at their highest level, care very much about what the next observer learns from the shape of the present event. The acknowledgement was not for Tal. Not for me. Not even primarily for the Mandate. It was for every polity watching our traffic channels, every species farther down our expansion path, every analyst in every neighboring system whose superiors still believed our fleet line was the kind of fact history arranged itself around. The message was simple. You can classify them however you like. You can count their stations. You can verify every datum in the packet they hand you. You can hear the warning voice inside your own institution and send it somewhere dim and procedural. You can do all of that. And they can still build the real war somewhere your assumptions taught you not to look. The withdrawal began 6 hours later. The 4 outer platforms remained exactly where they were, powered and patient, never firing because they no longer needed to. Human command checked in on the agreed intervals with a composure I found both offensive and, if I am being honest, deeply educational. No gloating. No strategic flourishes. No reminders about how close we had come to becoming example material instead of recorded embarrassment. Just timing. Verification. Spacing. The kind of procedural professionalism that tells you the people on the other side expected this version of the ending long before you did. Our fleet pulled itself backward through the soul threshold one careful segment at a time. It took 5 cycles. 5 cycles of repositioning. 5 cycles of waiting for windows we no longer controlled. 5 cycles of command traffic stripped of ambition and reduced to extraction math. 5 cycles in which every officer aboard every command hull had to live beside the fact that the elegant maps on which they had built certainty were not false enough to be dismissed, only old enough to be weaponized. Mara Vale remained aboard throughout the first 2 cycles of withdrawal under the original passage guarantee. That detail mattered too. She had not lied about that part. The extraction term had always been real. Her team, 31 names the system had treated as personal baggage attached to a defecting strategist, were, I would later learn, engineers, planners, data architects, and logistics specialists who had spent the last 3 years helping build the 4 cold points into the things that had just held a mandate fleet in place without firing a shot. There is a particular quality of intelligence work I admire even when it is used on me. This was that quality. On cycle 3 of the withdrawal, I received an internal notice reversing my suspension. Not with apology, of course. Institutions do not apologize while they are still metabolizing humiliation. The language described my conduct review as resolved pending reassignment and noted that my observed pattern sensitivity may have future utility in adaptive threat environments. That is what bureaucracies say when they would rather bite glass than write the words "you were right." I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny. Because it was, in its own way, exactly on brand. By the time the fleet crossed fully back into mandate-controlled lanes, the formal acknowledgement package had already been transmitted on every channel required by the human terms. I opened the public record copy and read it from beginning to end. It was short. Shorter than the reports we had generated around Mara Vale's package. Shorter than the verification packet. Shorter than the planning brief that had put the fleet on the vector she suggested. The most devastating texts often are. I sat there in deep archive with the acknowledgement glowing on the old terminal screen, survey canisters stacked around me like witnesses no one had invited, and understood at last that the humans had not asked us to surrender because surrender would have let us tell a simpler story later. They had asked us to narrate ourselves correctly. And that, for a civilization like ours, was the more punishing demand. Mara Vale asked to see me on withdrawal cycle 4. The request arrived through internal routing with so many override tags attached to it that for a moment I thought the system had glitched and assigned me, by clerical error, someone else's improbable life. I was still a reinstated but unplaced analyst sitting in deep archive with too much vindication and not enough authority. She was the human operative who had just helped engineer the most elegant public embarrassment in recent mandate memory. Our circles were not supposed to overlap. And yet there it was on my terminal. Source: Mara Vale requests analytical debrief with Registry Grade 4 Sel Aric. Clearance granted by command exception. I read it twice. Then I stood, straightened my archive jacket out of habit rather than hope, and walked to interview room 7. She was already there. Of course she was. Mara sat at the far side of the table with both hands folded loosely in front of her, posture relaxed, face unguarded in the way very dangerous people often are once the thing they came to do has been successfully completed. No guards inside the room. One outside the door. Standard recording node lit in the ceiling. Water untouched. When I entered, she looked up and gave me the same small professional nod she had probably used in 100 rooms across a dozen layers of deception. Analyst Aric, she said. Source Vale, I said. One corner of her mouth moved. That title seems outdated now. Not from this side of the table. I sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I was trying to decide whether I hated her. She, I think, was deciding how much truth I had earned. At last I said, "Why me?" "You filed 3 warning reports before your command silenced you," she said. "Then a 4th. Then an escalation above your own director. You found the freight pattern. You identified the missing coordinates. You were the only person in your system who asked the right question early enough for it to matter." "It didn't matter. It mattered to us," she said. That landed harder than I expected. Because that was the part one had understood and not understood since the platforms lit. I had assumed I was incidental. A procedural inconvenience. An almost problem absorbed by the larger smoothness of the plan. Mara watched my face with the calm attention of someone who had spent years reading much larger consequences in much smaller expressions. "You were never incidental," she said. I felt something old and unpleasant tighten under my chest plating. "You knew about me. We knew there was a high probability of a dissenting analyst if your institution behaved the way our long-term modeling suggested it would." "That is not the same answer." "No," she said. "It isn't." She reached into the slim case beside her chair and removed a single data wafer, dark and unmarked. She did not slide it across yet. She only turned it once between thumb and forefinger like a person reminding herself that objects can be simpler than the things they contain. "Your personal flag on Sol system traffic," she said. "Bright red. Pattern persistent. 8 years active with increasing private annotation density. Your access habits. Your cross-references. Your repeated category challenges. We found you 2 years before I entered your patrol corridor. I said nothing. What was there to say? She had found me. Not because I was brilliant enough to defeat the system. Because I was visible inside it in exactly the right way. A dissenting analyst, I said slowly, was part of the plan. A necessary component, she said. There it was. Not softened. Not apologized for. Not dramatized either. Just true. I looked at the untouched water on the table because for a second looking at her directly felt structurally unwise. You needed me to fail. We needed the system to hear you and continue anyway. She paused. That is different. It was. It also wasn't. I laughed once quietly. Not because it was funny. Because the alternative was to admit a level of violation my species did not possess elegant language for. The civilian freight. I looked up again. You wanted someone to see it. We wanted someone credible enough to see it, report it, and be overruled in a way that reassured your planners they had properly handled internal concern. There are sentences one hears and recognizes instantly as the final form of a thing that has already been hurting for some time. This was one of them. I thought of Carol's note. Observed concerns acknowledged. Current evidence supports continued cooperative processing. I thought of Tal Vane receiving my report, filing it under conduct, and proceeding with the operation at greater emotional ease because the dissent had now been processed into harmlessness. I thought of Deep Archive. I thought of the old freight logs and my own relief, sick and useless, when I found the coordinates because for one bright second I had believed discovery still meant leverage. It had not. Discovery had been expected. Accounted for. Required. You studied our fleet doctrine, I said. We studied your decision doctrine, she corrected gently. That, more than anything else, was the real wound. Not that the platforms had outgunned us. Not that the intelligence was outdated by design. Not even that the approach vector had been fed to Tal Vane through his own appetite for elegant certainty. The wound was that the humans had concluded, correctly, that the decisive battlefield was our bureaucracy. Our reporting chains. Our emotional habits. Our appetite for flattering explanations. Our confidence that hearing a warning and dismissing it through procedure was functionally the same as answering it. The fleet, I said, was only the visible part. Yes. And the acknowledgement clause. The formal written record? She asked. That wasn't for us either. It was for everyone, Mara said. Including you. I almost asked what that meant. Then I realized I already knew. The acknowledgement had never been a practical military term. It had been reputational terrain shaping. A forced archival correction. A public statement to every watching power that the mandate could be lured, mapped, and redirected by a species it had classified too low for too long. And, perhaps more importantly, a statement to anyone inside the mandate still capable of learning that their institutions were not simply unlucky. They were legible. Mara finally slid the data wafer across the table. Your reports, she said. Copies from our side. Annotations included. I stared at it. You kept them. We keep everything that matters. Why give them back? Because you were right, she said. And because if you're going to keep working inside the mandate, you should have an accurate record of what your system did with that fact. I picked up the wafer. It felt very light. Of course it did. Truth is usually lighter than the machinery built to refuse it. What happens now? I asked. It was not the best question in the room, but it was the one I had. Mara leaned back slightly. Your fleet completes withdrawal. The 10-cycle non-engagement period holds unless your side chooses stupidity on a historic scale. She said it without malice. The way a meteorologist might describe atmospheric instability. Our platforms return to dark. Officially, this becomes an incident, a case study, and a warning. Officially. She held my gaze. Unofficially, she said, it depends what people like you do with it. I looked down at the wafer again. People like me. Grade 4. Deep Archive. One damaged eye. One bright red flag in a monitoring system. One useful dissenter whose usefulness had turned out to be more complicated than any version of self-respect normally tolerates. You want correspondence, I said. I want accuracy, she said. Private channel. Strategic questions. Institutional behavior. Not operational targeting. A small pause. Understanding matters more if either side wants to avoid repeating the expensive versions of first contact. That was the human move, I realized. Not mercy. Not recruitment exactly. Continuation. Humans are never done with the lesson once the battle ends. They start studying the aftermath immediately. They build the next plan from what the last one taught them, including what it taught them about the minds trying to resist it. I should have said no. Any clean version of myself would have said no. Instead I asked, if I refuse? Then you refuse. She shrugged, slight and real. You're still useful to your people if they're smart enough to know that. And if they're not? That got the first true almost smile I had seen from her all cycle. Then, she said, I assume you'll keep filing reports. I hated how accurately she had me. When we stood, she offered her right hand. I had read about the gesture for years. Formal human closure. Mutual recognition. A vertical clasp evolved from older trust signals and repurposed by diplomacy into something that still retained a trace of its original risk. I extended my primary manipulator and met it as cleanly as our anatomies allowed. It was, without question, the least graceful diplomatic contact in the recorded history of either species. Analyst Aric, she said at the door, for what it's worth, your 12% mattered. No, I said. It mattered to you. She considered that. Then nodded once. Yes, she said. That too. After she left, I remained alone in interview room 7 with the wafer in my hand and the recording node's soft ceiling light reflecting off the table between us. The fleet completed withdrawal on Cycle 6. I was reinstated on Cycle 19. Not promoted, of course. Institutions do not reward accurate descent directly after a humiliation. They repurpose it. I was assigned to a newly created office with a laughably noble title, Adaptive Threat Review, and given 2 junior analysts, 3 stale budgets, and every problem nobody important wanted near their optimism. I kept the position. I kept filing reports. I kept one bright red private flag on every Sol-adjacent shipping pattern, treaty motion, civilian freight anomaly, and cultural doctrine update I could legally justify and several I could not. Years passed. The non-engagement window neared expiration. A new generation of officers entered command convinced they had learned the right lesson from the defeat. This is always the danger. Systems love lessons as long as the lesson confirms that next time they will personally be smarter than the people who previously failed. I sat in 3 briefings where I heard some variation of, we know what to watch for now. Every time I felt tired in the same specific place. Because knowledge of the previous trick is not wisdom. It is often only the newest assumption waiting to be used as scaffolding by someone more patient than you. On the morning I finished this account, I received a private channel message routed through a path that officially did not exist and unofficially had been in regular, careful use for years. It was from Mara. 3 lines. Commercial freight density through your outer contractor shell network has increased 18% in 22 months. You may want to ask why. File the report where they can ignore it properly. I closed all 3 eyes. Then opened the damaged one first, out of habit, followed by the other 2. And I laughed. Quietly. Without joy. With recognition. Because that, in the end, is the final lesson the humans gave us. Not that they are stronger. Not that they are smarter in every room. Not even that they can build better traps. It is this. They are consistent enough to keep learning while everyone else is still congratulating themselves on having learned once. And consistency, if you have ever worked inside an empire and survived long enough to become honest, is what wins almost every war that matters.